Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the biggest questions you can possibly ask, a question that a brilliant mind from a totally unexpected field decided to tackle. We're going to unpack the ideas in a short but incredibly powerful book from 1944 called What is Life? Now, this wasn't just some dusty old volume. Think of it more like an intellectual hand grenade that completely changed the way modern science works. And the person who pulled the pin? Well, it wasn't a biologist, it wasn't a doctor, it was Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics. I mean, this is a guy whose name you associate with the weird, fuzzy world of atoms, with uncertainty and wave functions. And yet, right in the thick of World War II, he turned that massive brain of his away from the stars and the subatomic particles, and he pointed it squarely at the living cell. He looked at life itself and saw something more than just a biological curiosity. He saw a deep physical puzzle, a kind of miracle that seemed to be breaking the very laws of physics that he himself had helped write. So in this explainer, we're going to follow the breadcrumbs of his incredible logic that he came up with nearly 10 years before we even knew what DNA looked like, but which ended up being the treasure map that led scientists straight to the double helix.
And that really is the question, isn't it? How on earth can a physicist, of all people, solve what was, and maybe still is, this single greatest mystery in all of biology? To really get why this was so amazing, you have to picture what the world of science was like back in the 1940s. Physics was on top of the world. It was the golden age, you know? They were celebrating these huge revolutions like relativity and quantum mechanics, unlocking the absolute bedrock secrets of the universe, of matter and energy. Biology, on the other hand, was, well, it was a very different kind of science. It was much more about observing and describing. Genetics was really just getting started. Scientists knew that traits were passed down on these things called chromosomes, but the gene itself, it was just an idea, a placeholder with no real physical form. And a lot of biology was still kind of haunted by this old idea called vitalism, this belief that there was some special non-physical life force, some magic spark that made living things different from rocks and water. And then, into this world walks Erwin Schrödinger, and he's what you'd call a physicalist. He was totally convinced there was no ghost in the machine. He believed that life, all of it, had to be explainable by the laws of physics and chemistry we already knew. You just had to be smart enough to apply them in the right way. He'd look at a plant or a dog, or even himself, and he saw a direct challenge to the biggest, most powerful law in all of physics, the second law of thermodynamics. Now, this is the great sort of sad rule of the cosmos. It says that everything, everywhere, is always falling apart, always moving towards a state of more disorder, more randomness, a state physicists call entropy. But life was this beautiful, glaring exception. It didn't just hold on to its incredibly complex order in the face of all this universal chaos. It made copies of that order and passed it down generation after generation. For Schrödinger, this wasn't just some philosophical idea. It was a real physical paradox that was just screaming for an explanation. And his book?
So here's the game plan for our journey today. First, we're going to dig into that impossible question that started it all, to really feel the paradox that drove Schrödinger. Then, we'll uncover his first brilliant insight into how life stays alive, what he called its secret diet. After that, we'll get to his most famous, almost prophetic prediction, the code of life. From there, we'll see how these wild ideas literally changed the world of science. And finally, we'll see how Schrödinger's ghost is still with us right inside the most cutting-edge technology of the 21st century.
Okay, first things first. Let's tackle the physicist's impossible question. This is really the heart of it all, the central puzzle that Schrödinger just couldn't let go of.
You really can't overstate just how gutsy this was in 1944. Erwin Schrödinger wasn't just some random physicist with a side hobby. I mean, this was a Nobel Prize winner. He'd literally written the equation that describes how quantum systems work. He was basically scientific royalty, so for him to wade into biology, he wasn't doing it like a naturalist, collecting butterflies. He was coming in like a physicist, demanding to know how the machine actually worked on a molecular level. He was taking dead aim at that idea of vitalism, the belief in a special life force. The vitalist would point to weird things like how if you cut an early sea urchin embryo in half, you don't get two halves of a sea urchin. You get two complete, perfectly formed, smaller sea urchins. It's as if some magical holistic force was guiding the development. Schrödinger's view, which we call reductionism, was nope. He believed all of that, no matter how mind-bendingly complex, had to come down to the bumping and grinding of atoms and molecules, all following the known rules of physics. He was making a bet. A bet that there were no new forces to be discovered, that everything we already knew, including the weirdness of quantum mechanics, was enough to explain life, if we just had the courage to look at it the right way. His book of lectures was like throwing down a gauntlet. It was a challenge to the entire scientific world to finally build a bridge between the living and the non-living using the language of physics.
So this slide lays out the fundamental battle perfectly. On one side, you've got the entire universe, and it's ruled by this unbreakable law, the second law of thermodynamics. What it basically says is that in any closed system, disorder, or what physicists call entropy, always increases. It's the law of universal decay. You know, you build a beautiful, intricate sandcastle on the beach. What happens? The wind and the waves will 100% of the time break it down into a random, disordered pile of sand. Or think about a deck of cards. You open a brand new pack, and it's perfectly ordered, right? Ace through king, all the suits together. Give it a few good shuffles, and it's completely random. And no matter how many more times you shuffle it, it's never, ever going to magically pop back into that perfect order. This law says that the ultimate fate of the whole universe is something called heat death, a state of maximum boringness, where everything is spread out, lukewarm, and nothing interesting can ever happen again. It's a one-way street to total chaos. And then you have life. I mean, just look at a single bacterium, never mind a giant redwood tree or a person. It is an absolute masterpiece of complex, specific order. And it's not static like a diamond. It's a dynamic, buzzing city of molecular machines, all working together perfectly. And this thing, this organism, actively fights against that universal pull towards chaos. It fixes itself, it builds amazing things out of simple stuff, and it holds on to its ridiculously improbable ordered state for years. And then, the most amazing part, it has a blueprint inside it to pass that exact same order on to its kids. So the question is, how can this little island of order even exist in a giant cosmic ocean that is always flowing towards chaos? How is life able to swim so hard against the universe's most powerful current?
And that brings us to the first part of Schrödinger's brilliant answer. He knew he needed a real, physical mechanism to explain how life could possibly push back against this relentless march of entropy. He had to figure out how to slay this thermodynamic dragon. And the weapon he came up with was just incredibly elegant.
Schrödinger's genius solution was a concept he called negative entropy. Now, that name is a little confusing, so let's be clear. He wasn't saying there's some new, magical force in the universe that fights entropy. Not at all. He was pointing to a really simple fact. A living thing isn't a closed system. It's not a sealed-off box. It's an open system, constantly swapping matter and energy with the world around it. And he argued that to avoid the decay and disorder that's always building up inside our own bodies, an organism has to do two things. First, it has to constantly suck in order from its environment. Second, it has to constantly dump the disorder or entropy that it creates back out into the environment. So this negative entropy is really just a name for that intake of order. It's kind of like, imagine you're a neat freak and you're obsessed with keeping your house perfectly spotless. But just living in your house creates mess, right? Dust settles, things get out of place. So to keep your house pristine, you're constantly tidying up and throwing all the garbage and mess out the window into the street. Your house stays perfectly ordered, but the total mess of your house plus the street has actually increased. You've paid for your local order by creating a bigger mess elsewhere. And that's exactly what life does. It keeps the second law of thermodynamics perfectly happy.
So what does it actually mean to eat order? This is a really radical way of looking at something we do every day, eating. We usually think, I'm eating for energy, for calories, and for building materials. And yeah, that's totally true. But Schrödinger said there's something much deeper going on. When you eat, say, an apple, you're not just getting its sugar and vitamins. You are consuming its structure. That apple is full of these incredibly complex, beautifully ordered molecules like starch and sugars that the apple tree painstakingly built using the highly ordered energy from sunlight. Your body then takes these big, ordered molecules and systematically breaks them apart. It uses the energy from those chemical bonds to power all of its own projects of creating order, like building new proteins or copying your DNA. And what are the waste products? Simple, disordered, low-energy molecules like carbon dioxide and water, which you then just breathe out or excrete. You breathe in ordered oxygen, you breathe out disordered carbon dioxide. So every single thing your metabolism does is basically an act of importing a highly ordered, low-entropy state from the outside world to fight against your own internal slide into high-entropy chaos. Being alive is a constant, non-stop process of pumping order out of the environment just to pay our thermodynamic bills, moment by moment.
And this one sentence just nails the whole idea. It's so powerful. It's poetic, but it's also deeply physically true, and it completely changes how you look at biology. A living creature isn't just some passive thing being knocked around by the laws of physics. It's an active agent, engaged in a constant, desperate battle against those very laws. Life isn't just being here, it's an act of defiance. It's the process of eating order to create and maintain more order, in a universe that wants nothing more than to tear it all down. This one little idea reframes all of metabolism as a profound physical principle.
So that brings us to his second big insight, and this one might be even more famous. He had just elegantly explained how an organism keeps itself ordered during its own life. But now he turned to an even deeper mystery. How is all of that incredible complex order passed down with such stunning accuracy from one generation to the next? He was basically trying to use logic to break into the secret vault of heredity itself.
This was the next giant hurdle. Back in the 40s, scientists knew that the instructions for life were carried on the chromosomes inside every cell. They called these little instruction packets genes. But nobody had a clue what a gene was actually made of, or how it could possibly work. So Schrödinger came at this not like a biologist, but like a physicist thinking about data storage. And the list of requirements for this mystery molecule was just insane. It seemed like a total contradiction. First, it had to contain what he famously called a code script, the entire detailed plan for building and running a whole organism. That means it had to be unbelievably complex and hold a ton of information. But second, that same molecule had to be incredibly stable, almost permanent. I mean, think about it. The genes for things like eye color or fur color have been passed down almost perfectly for thousands and thousands of generations, all while being jiggled around at body temperature inside a cell. So what kind of stuff, what kind of molecule could possibly do both of those things, hold nearly infinite variety of information, and have the strength to last for ages?
To crack this puzzle, Schrödinger came up with a fantastic analogy. He figured, first of all, that the gene couldn't be a normal or what he called a periodic crystal. A periodic crystal, like a tiny grain of salt or a diamond, is definitely stable. Its atoms are locked into this really strong, rigid grid. So that checks the box for permanence. But the whole point of its structure is that it's simple and it repeats. A salt crystal is just sodium, then chlorine, over and over and over. He compared it to a really simple wallpaper pattern, where the same little flower design is just repeated endlessly. You can't write a great novel if your only letter is the letter A. The amount of information you could store in a periodic crystal is basically zero. It could never hold the blueprint for a human being. So he invented something totally new, an idea that only existed in his head, an aperiodic crystal. This was his moment of pure genius. He imagined a molecule that had the long, stable backbone of a crystal, its atoms locked in place by strong bonds. But, and this is the key, its internal structure didn't repeat. It would be built from just a few different types of building blocks, like letters in an alphabet. But these blocks would be arranged in a long, complex, non-repeating sentence. And the source material has this beautiful comparison. It's not like wallpaper, it's like a Raphael tapestry. It's not a repeating pattern, it's an intricate, one-of-a-kind masterpiece where every single thread has a specific purpose in creating the bigger picture. A structure like that could hold a practically unlimited amount of information.
So the answer was the aperiodic crystal. This one concept beautifully solved both problems at once. The crystal part of the name explained the stability. Schrödinger knew from his physics that the covalent bonds holding molecules together are really strong. He figured that to break one of those bonds and change the sequence, which is what a mutation is, you'd need a pretty big jolt of energy, a quantum leap as he called it. This would explain why genes are so stable, but also why mutations can happen, but there are rare, all-or-nothing events. And then the aperiodic part of the name provided the massive information storage. If you use a handful of different building blocks, say 4 or 5 kinds, and you string them together in a long, non-repeating chain, you can encode a ridiculous amount of information in a tiny space. It's exactly how the 26 letters of our alphabet can be arranged to write every single book ever written. And just like that, without knowing anything about the actual chemistry, he had logically deduced the essential physical properties of the DNA molecule. almost a full decade before anybody laid eyes on its structure. It was just an absolutely incredible feat of pure reason.
And right here, in his own words, you can feel the real power of what he was getting at. Just look at the language he's using. He's not just talking about chemicals and molecules. He's talking about information. He uses the phrase code script. This was the huge mental shift. He completely reframed the problem of genetics. It wasn't about finding some mystery goo anymore. It was about cracking a code. The gene was no longer just some vague biological idea. It was now a physical data storage device, a microscopic message written in a chemical alphabet. And it was that very language that got a whole generation of physicists and chemists excited to go looking for a molecule that was capable of carrying a code.
So let's talk about the incredible fallout from all of these ideas. Because Schrödinger's little book wasn't just some interesting thought experiment. It landed like a meteor in the scientific community, and it completely changed the direction of biology in the 20th century.
That is the absolute best way to describe what this book did. Its real power wasn't that it had all the final answers. Its power was that it asked the questions in a way that was completely irresistible. It took the most exciting, most profound mysteries in biology, and it translated them into the language of physics, of chemistry, of information. And think about the timing. Right after World War II, you had all of these brilliant young physicists who had worked on things like the atomic bomb, and they were looking for new problems to solve, hopefully more life-affirming problems. Schrödinger's book was basically a giant help wanted sign aimed directly at them. It said, hey you, the most interesting puzzles in the universe right now aren't out in space, they're right here, inside a living cell. And you, with your physicist toolkit, are exactly the person we need to solve them. It made biology seem intellectually thrilling to a whole new group of scientists who thought in terms of numbers and laws.
And this connection, it's not just a nice story, it's historical fact. Both James Watson, who is a young biologist from America, and Francis Crick, a British physicist who had switched over to biology, both of them explicitly said that Schrödinger's book was one of their main inspirations. Crick himself said the book made him realize that you could think about these deep biological problems in a physical way. The book essentially gave them their target. They weren't just blindly looking for some random molecule in the cell. They were actively, consciously hunting for Schrödinger's aperiodic crystal. They were looking for a physical structure that could actually carry a code. And then, in 1953, when Watson and Crick finally put together their model of the DNA double helix, it was this incredible aha moment. What did they find? They found a long, stable molecule with the strong backbone which gave it that crystal-like stability, and tucked inside, what was there? A simple alphabet of 4 chemical bases, A, T, C, and G, arranged in a long, complex, non-repeating, information-packed sequence. It was, in every single important way, the exact structure that Schrödinger had predicted with nothing but pure logic 9 years earlier.
But the story doesn't just stop in 1953 with DNA. In a lot of ways, that was just the beginning of the story. Schrödinger's ideas have only gotten more powerful and more relevant over the years. His ghost, you could say, is now haunting the most advanced, most disruptive technologies we have today. And his original quest to understand life as a physical system, well, that quest is more urgent now than ever.
And here's where these 80-year-old ideas give us this incredible, unified way of understanding the 2 biggest revolutions of our lifetime. So first, let's talk about gene editing. Things like CRISPR. This is the literal physical manifestation of the information-based idea he came up with. CRISPR is basically a word processor for the genome. You have a little guide molecule that acts like a find command, locating a precise spot in that long aperiodic crystal of DNA. And then an enzyme acts like molecular scissors, letting us cut, delete, or paste new information right into the code. We're not just reading the code script of life anymore. We are actively becoming the programmers. And then think about artificial intelligence. An AI, especially a big neural network, is its own kind of code script. It's a massive, complex, non-repeating structure of connections. And how does an AI system keep itself in its highly ordered working state? Well, it feeds on negative entropy. For an AI, that food comes in 2 forms. It consumes huge amounts of ordered structured data from the internet in order to learn, and it consumes huge amounts of highly ordered electrical energy just to run its calculations and maintain the integrity of its own complex structure. It's amazing. Schrödinger's book, written to explain a bacterium, accidentally gave us the conceptual tools to understand both genetic engineering and artificial intelligence in the 21st century.
And this leads us to a really deep philosophical question that comes directly out of Schrödinger's idea of life as information. If our whole existence, our bodies, our personalities, are all written in a molecular language, it kind of forces us to rethink our own role in the universe. On one hand, with things like gene editing, it feels like we're grabbing the keyboard and mouse. We're getting this awesome and, frankly, terrifying power to be the programmers, to debug and rewrite the very source code that makes us who we are. But on the other hand, we are still, without a doubt, the output of that 4-billion-year-old program. Our consciousness, our hopes, our fears, are they anything more than just the result of this incredibly complex program running on our biological computer? Are we, as some scientists would argue, just survival machines that our immortal genes built, the program that evolution wrote just so it could make more copies of itself? The line between who's writing the story and who's in the story has gotten incredibly, incredibly blurry.
And that brings us to the final, huge question, the one for our time. If life is a code written in chemicals and AI is a code written in silicon, what's the real fundamental difference? Is it just the material it's written on? You know, the wetware of carbon versus the hardware of computer chips? Or is there something more, something special about the biological program? Is consciousness something that can only come from the messy, analog, complicated reality of a living cell? Or is it something that doesn't care about the hardware at all? Is it just an inevitable result for any system, biological or artificial, that gets complex enough, that processes enough information, all while holding itself together by feeding on negative entropy? Erwin Schrödinger started out trying to explain life with the laws of physics to get rid of the need for any magic. And he succeeded so brilliantly that he gave us a way of thinking so powerful that it now forces us to ask, what is the definition of life anyway? And are we on the verge of creating it all over again? That is a question that is much, much louder today than it ever was before.